Welcome to the channel, viewers. NDIS set for major overhaul.
After months of hard-fought negotiations with the states and territories, finally a breakthrough.
These are the first and most significant co-governance changes since the inception of the scheme a decade ago.
Labor's proposed changes are designed to rein in the ballooning cost of the NDIS.
It's growing at an unsustainable rate.
Costs projected to grow by 14% a year would be reduced to 8% through a system based on need rather than diagnosis. Greater government powers to seize any account suspected of fraud, and a new definition of what constitutes an NDIS support that's still to be negotiated with the states and territories.
We already provide significant additional support. We want to make sure that the federal government continues to recognise that as we move forward with the future changes to the NDIS.
To get the states on board, they've been offered faster decision-making on new NDIS rules, and a move from unanimous to majority support from premiers and chief ministers for rule changes with significant impacts on people with disability. In terms of the budget, the stakes for the government are high, but not as high as they are for the community. For many, the NDIS is what gives them safety and independence, and major disability representative organisations are urging senators to vote against this legislation tomorrow.
Mr Shorten has been talking about making an agreement with the states and territories, which is great, but we were not there and we're not at the table.
We're not scared of change, but we are scared of this bill. It puts our lives and our freedom and our rights in danger.
The reality is that what we are doing is securing the future of the scheme, and that is what matters.
The legislation is expected to pass the Parliament with coalition support. Claudia Long, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, for all the noise in the political debate right now about arrivals from Gaza and whether national security has been put at risk, behind the scenes, there are signs of actual bipartisan cooperation on a range of fronts. There's already been agreement on appointing administrators to the CFMEU. Agreement is also close on aged care reform, a new Parliamentary Standards Commission, and changes to the NDIS. These changes are aimed at putting the NDIS, we're told, on a more sustainable footing. Now, some in the disability sector are concerned about what this might all mean, and some in the sector remain concerned on another front. That's the government's response a few weeks ago to the Disability Royal Commission. Now, that response probably didn't get the attention it deserved a few weeks ago. This was, after all, a 4-year inquiry that heard from nearly 10,000 people with disabilities and their families. It made more than 220 recommendations. Some of the most important were merely noted by the government in its response, with no commitment to necessarily adopt them. So where has this left the sector? A few weeks on from the government's response, I want to take a look at how the dust has settled and talk to one of those who led this Royal Commission. I'm David Spears on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Rhonda Galbally was one of the 6 commissioners selected to run this Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with a disability. Dr Galbally has a lifelong disability as a result of polio, has spent decades advocating for disability rights and brought that lived experience to this landmark inquiry. Dr Galbally, welcome. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I should note at the outset that you're not here to talk about the NDIS changes, what's happening on that front. That was not something that you examined in this commission. But I would like to, start with a bit of a recap of what you did look at and what you did recommend in this Royal Commission. Perhaps not all 222 recommendations, but in your mind, what were some of the most significant that we should keep in mind?
Well, we recommended, first of all, a whole range of recommendations to actually prevent violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation in a variety of settings. We examined especially all the contributors to violence, what makes it more likely. And we found that segregation was the top issue. It came up through the research, it came up through public hearings, and it came up over and over and over through a huge number of the 10,000 people we heard from, that not only was segregation dangerous in that violence and abuse and neglect happened in it, it also was dangerous in that if little children think that children with disabilities are so different and so other, so that they're not going to have them in their classroom and be able to see them, play with them, see the differences and accept them, then that leads to the fear and it leads to the othering. It means that people with disabilities are completely different and almost not human. And therefore, the terrible vilification and hate and violence that we saw, that's in a vicious cycle of segregation. So that was really important.
And just on that, there wasn't agreement, however, amongst the Royal Commissioners, was there, about phasing out segregation, special schools, group homes, segregation in the workplace. Do you think that lack of unity amongst the Royal Commissioners made it any easier for government, state and federal to not adopt this?
Oh, undoubtedly, that's true. And yet it's not very surprising in a way. I mean, unless you've been part of the world of disability, you would take on exactly what I've been describing. Or, it'd range from charity, or concern, we better keep them in these places because otherwise something will happen to them, which is actually, when you look at the research, something is going to happen to them in those places. So it's exactly the opposite of that fear. But also there would have been a fair amount of, fear and repulsion and everything that you get in the outside world, you'd get inside the Commission as well. So it's not at all surprising that this happened. But that's where the topic of leadership and government, I'm very interested that the government's first response to the Royal Commission was to invite submissions on the Royal Commission when there'd already been 10,000 responses to the Royal Commission and there were 300 responses to the government's invitation. And they're making policy based on that. That just sounds extraordinary, really. And again, they're saying about some of these areas where they've pushed them into the too hard basket, we're going to consult. Well, they have consulted. That was the 10,000 responses and huge number of submissions to the Royal Commission. So it takes leadership now to look at all the contemporary models of disability around the world, which we did, and to think, well, how can Australia move forward in honour of the treaty we signed as the first country, one of the first, in the world to sign the Treaty on Disability Rights.
Did you know that Australia is seen as the most disabled country in the world?
We're now not fully signed up to it because the Australian government's response says inclusion means segregation as well, which is completely, I can't think of the right word to use, but it's just not true. It's not what it says. And all the general comments that have been provided make it very, very clear, including the special rapporteurs from the UN that we heard from, that inclusion does not mean segregation.
So you mentioned there putting this in the too hard basket by asking for further consultations, which clearly you don't think are necessary. Just to be clear here, are you saying what you've seen from governments, federal and state so far, really is a lack of leadership on this very core issue of ending segregation?
Yes, I think that the government that I'd give a little bit more credit to is Western Australia. And they've been a leading government in disability for decades now. They were the first state in Australia to phase out group homes in a way by offering people the same amount of money to be able to live in the community as in a group home. And I tell you what, they voted with their feet. They voted to move out of segregated living and into community living with about 40 different very creative ways of doing that. So not all the governments are at the same position. Queensland has the best act. It's got a terrific act based on the international treaty, but it hasn't fulfilled its own act because it's been building special schools at a faster rate than any other state. So, it's, but the Commonwealth, by and large, in this area of everything that surrounds the NDIS, has not shown leadership, I would say. So that, the NDIS is clearly a leading program, hugely valuable, but everything that's needed to make what is an individual package work by making the community inclusive and safe hasn't been done.
And by that, are you suggesting that whatever changes come on the NDIS to make it more sustainable, as we're told, aren't really going to fundamentally change the lives and the risks facing people with a disability if they're not implementing the recommendations that you made?
Yes, I think they go together. And, part of our recommendations are making everything safer, with the Quality and Safeguard Commission and, all the things that should happen on that level. But very significant recommendations, which interestingly have been pushed right away. They've been either noted, which means no, or they've been called subject to further consideration, which sort of means no. It means, a long time away where we haven't even got a process to further consider. And they're the recommendations that could really help to get people with disabilities' lives going really well so that they can use their package properly and fully.
Do you think the sector needs at least a bit of certainty? You mentioned it's not quite a no because there's further consultations and consideration about these ideas of phasing out special schools, for example. Would it be better just have some certainty for everyone to say, look, we're just not going to do it?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I think that would be really terrible. To leave the door open just a chink on group homes and sheltered workshops and sub-minimum wages. I mean, can you believe that the only group of Australians to receive miles below the minimum wage are people with disabilities? I mean, even that was put in the further consideration basket. It was such a no-brainer. The no to schools from the Commonwealth, which means no comment, I found really shocking. Because the Commonwealth has a huge role to play. I mean, that's where leadership is needed. That's where a national roadmap would be really highly valuable. They're responsible for private and non-government schools. So, there could be attached to the grants a requirement that children with disabilities are included and not kicked out come year 11 when they might bring the marks down, which stops those schools marketing. So, there's a lot the Commonwealth needed to do. And for them to just almost, push it onto the states completely, I thought showed huge lack of leadership.
Did anyone from the Commonwealth, from the federal government, talk to you about this, about why they're not showing the leadership that you're calling for?
No, I mean, I've read their response very closely, and it's just bewildering. I think it is. I think it's interesting that the discussion about governance, which was a minister for disability, a department and a commission, and also part of it with a Disability Rights Act, that there was sort of reference in the Commonwealth's response to leadership already existing. Well, I think their response shows a complete lack of leadership. And, that perhaps those recommendations, I mean, unless the topic is full inclusion and the proper enactment of the treaty, then, whether or not you have a minister for disability or not is a bit beside the point. But after seeing the response, I think we're never going to get anywhere unless we get that dedicated governance and a minister for disability in the cabinet.
And just explain to me what difference that would make, because there's a minister for the NDIS, there's a minister for social services. What difference would it make having someone in the cabinet as a minister for disability rights?
Yeah, this is how these people go around in circles. They have had the baseline way in which NDS was going to run, but they stepped over the boundaries. The people that were running NDIS broadened the boundaries, and this is where it's all fallen apart. How will another minister in whatever going to change anything? It's not going to change anything. They're trying to bring it back to its baseline.
Well, it would mean that every government department, every portfolio, they'd be on their case. That the Attorney General's department, with the treaty, how come we are prevaricating and pulling back from the treaty and saying inclusion means segregation? This minister would then prosecute that and really take it up and fight about it. How come?
I think this is just pulling at straws. There's so many financial issues and corruptions that are taking place in the NDIS. This isn't even getting talked about. We need to get to the specifics and weed out the people that are corrupting the NDIS by abusing it that shouldn't even be in it.
Education has handballed this completely to the states. Like, that would have been prosecuted and fought for. There'd be a real dedication to these issues. The health recommendations have been accepted, and it's really valuable to see that, but they have to be expanded through the Medicare agreement and the states. So I just think now I think it would be valuable. I was pro, but it wasn't my top priority. But after this response from the government, I now am convinced that dedicated infrastructure we have to give it a go, really, because this is absolutely unacceptable.
Are there other countries that are getting this right when it comes to ending the segregation, dealing with inclusion properly?
Well, there are three basic segregated settings, and they relate to each other. School's the starting point, and as I said, that relates not only to violence and abuse in the segregated setting, it also relates to much, really negative outcomes. In all the research, you get much better learning outcomes in an inclusive school. I could go on and on. So that's one setting, but it relates to the other two because the Royal Commission commissioned data modelling based on the NDIS data, which is a very rich data set, that showed that if you go to a special school, you're 85% more likely to end up in sheltered employment and group home living. So it sort of influences, it's called a polished pathway to segregation. You're on a slippery slide to being in a segregated life for the rest of your life. Then there's the group home, and so that's the second setting. And then there's the sheltered employment, and that's the third setting. And, lots of countries are doing far better than Australia. Portugal has just recently, rather abruptly pulled out of special education completely. New Brunswick in Canada did it overnight. By the way, I just want to point out that the commissioners that supported moving out of segregated education, we've recommended 28 years. And we did that, we got beaten up for that. Like the advocates really got stuck into us. How come you recommended 28 years? Well, we did it to avoid exactly what we're looking at now. We wanted a proper phasing. We wanted mainstream schools to have years, decades to become inclusive. So we know that if you did it overnight, it'd be absolutely terrible and painful. So we recommended that there'd be, a generation go all the way through and a new generation. They could take new input into special schools to 2032. So, grandfathering, responsibility, and still the government rejected it. And that's very disappointing. Ireland's about to do it. Yeah, sorry, Finland, I could go on.
Okay, so there are jurisdictions where it's happening. Look, as you noted, though, there's still a chink of light. The government hasn't completely closed the door to some of these ideas. But just to be clear, it's fair to say you're not holding out too much hope based on what you've seen so far.
I'm holding out hope because of the work of, very underfunded, incredible workloads, these little groups of people with disabilities and family members.
I have to disagree with that. Some of the biggest incomes are coming in to people through NDIS. Now, if these people are rorting the system to get it, well, that's on them if they get caught. But I don't think NDIS, when it's worked from its baseline, from the way it was in which it was designed, leaves anybody short. The figures tell you that the financial debt that it's putting on the country, an unsustainable cost, tells you that.
And they're not going to let this go. And for the first time in Australia, there's a Royal Commission has recommended these things, even if on some of them there was a split in the vote. On group homes and sheltered workshops, there were 4 out of 6. On schooling, there were 3 out of 6. But the ones that recommended it were the ones who had disability and had a lived experience of these issues as a parent as well. That was Barbara Bennett. So, I think that the map's there, the detailed recommendations are there. There's more work occurring to put flesh on the bones of the area of phasing out group homes. The Grattan Institute's about to release a report into that. And so, I don't think it'll ever go away. I think the genie's out of the bottle now. So I think it's been really worthwhile to get that done. Deeply disappointing, though, in the response, but still worthwhile to get that done, I think.
So just finally then, how do you rate this government's approach to transforming the lives of people with a disability? We're yet to see what it's going to change on the NDIS. We've seen some of that already. But together with this response to your Royal Commission, how do you rate its performance?
Look, I rate, without commenting or getting into the changes in the NDIS, when you look at how it's transformed lives, everyone's life, I might add, except those in group homes and in sheltered workshops, hasn't transformed their lives because even the NDIS hasn't addressed the issue of segregation. But everyone else's lives, which is a huge number of the people on the 660,000, it's absolutely transformational. So I'd give it about, say, 80%, because the 20% they can't get until they fix up segregated living and work. On the rest of the living, the response to segregation and to the treaty, the mucking around with the treaty, and not being clear about Australia's. All Australia needs to do is say, yes, we commit completely to the treaty, and we know it'll take years. It may take 28 years, which is what we've recommended on Article 24, which is about inclusive education. So that's all they need to say. And I'd give them about sort of 20%, maybe less. And part of that would be in establishing the Royal Commission. They'd have to get a tick for that.
It's a pretty low mark, though, when you look at their response, that's fair to say.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Rhonda Galbally, really appreciate talking to you. Thank you for your take on how the government has responded to this. And we look forward to seeing whether there is going to be any further progress down the track. Good to talk to you.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you too.
And